All right, so today we are going to continue with our forensics topics, and today looking at forensic anthropology. This is one that I just recently added, um, only because there's so much that shows up in the media still today regarding skeletal remains. Maybe there's an excavation being done for a new building or something like that, and oftentimes, or I shouldn't say oftentimes, but sometimes they'll find skeletal remains, and so they'll talk about being able to identify maybe whom those skeletal remains belong to, or something along those lines. So I think it's a relevant topic to include, um, really for that purpose alone. But when you start thinking about the returning of human remains from overseas, maybe individuals that have been involved in some type of war. So they maybe they were MIA or KIA, and their bodies were not returned at the time of the conclusion of that war, and so there are a number of groups that are responsible for helping to secure the returns of their remains to American soil. So again, all of that is part of this anthropological analysis, and so I think it's important to include that in this section. So some of the things that hopefully you should be able to do at the conclusion of this section, understand what role anthropology plays in a forensic investigation. Now, unlike some of the more recent topics that we've looked at, some of the anthropological evidence could be enough to be a standalone part in a criminal case. Most of the time, it won't be. It's just going to be another part that investigators or prosecutors or even defense attorneys, as the case might be, will use in the case in helping either to defend their client or prosecute um, the suspect, whatever the case might be. Making sure to look at or be able to explain what characteristics are used in the formation of a biological profile. Again, a biological profile in this context will be information that's used to help describe what that individual was like when they were living. So maybe build, um, stature, potentially jobs that they may have done, things like that. A lot of that, or some of that information, can be gleaned from skeletal remains. Understand some basic anatomy and physiology stuff with regard to bone structure, how those bones function to do the job that they do, and some of the changes that we see that take place in humans over time. Those are important parts in terms of what's taking place, how investigators go about collecting and documenting skeletal evidence. I shouldn't just say investigators, uh, because when you look at maybe like ancient sites that have been discovered, you've still got anthropologists that are going to be on site helping to collect that information as well. So it doesn't have to just be from a criminal standpoint. Hopefully that makes sense. And then being able to look at skeletal remains, and this probably from like a crime scene standpoint ends up being some of the most important stuff, right? Being able to determine the gender of the individual that whose bones are represented there, the potential age, um, any type of ethnic origins, and then being able to identify whether or not there's any trauma that took place uh, on that individual or with that individual prior to their demise, or potentially that could have led to their demise. So those are going to be the big parts that are going to be associated with forensic anthropology, this particular section. All right, so forensic anthropology, just using skeletal remains to be able to provide information about the individual whose remains you're examining or are being examined. Um, whether we're talking about it from the standpoint of a victim, from a forensic standpoint, that's going to be most common. But again, just anthropologically in general, we're going to be looking at characteristics that help to describe what that individual's life was like prior to them dying. Okay, so the very first thing that has to happen in the event that bones are discovered on a site, maybe in an unusual spot where you wouldn't anticipate them being. The very first thing that has to happen is you have to determine whether those bones are human in origin or whether they are not. If they're not human in origin, again, unless it's something really unusual, you're probably not going to worry about it a whole lot. Um, maybe there's a dig site. So in Morrow County, obviously, we had the dig site on the Walker farm where they had found some mastodon bones. Right, that was an unusual find. That was not something that most people turn up in their field, but Mr. Walker happened to find while doing some work, and so that was a big deal. Um, my wife and I's oldest daughter works for a coroner's office, and she had a case maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, where some individuals were doing some work on some I don't remember if it was septic or what it was, but it was something where they had some pipes in their yard, and as they were doing some excavating, they found some bones, and so they immediately stopped. They made a call to the coroner's office, and the coroner's office went out. They in turn had to contact an anthrop. No, they didn't. They didn't do an anthropologist. They did just their pathologist. Pathologist went out and took a look at some of the bones and determined that they were of non-human origin, which again they could get there any number of ways, just as a result of animal activity or whatever the case might be. So again, that's the first thing that has to happen because most of the time, if they're of non-human origin, it could be any number of it could be or the result of any number of other animals. Once they have the collection of bones complete, or as complete as they can make it, they're going to be able to hopefully come up with some type of biological profile that helps to describe a little bit about the individual whose bones are being examined. So, age and sex are going to be two of the big ones, right? Being able to determine about how old the individual was and whether they were male or female. And then from that, you might be able to get an estimation on height or body size. That's going to be important. Ethnicity, there are some characteristics that are used. Uh, Depending upon whether you're doing this class online or in person, we will do a lab that looks at some of the traits associated with skeletons with regard to ethnicity, and then the evidence of trauma or disease. Those end up being very important as well. Now, um, oftentimes these forensic anthropologists, in the case of finding some bones that are in fact human, what they will oftentimes do is begin with persons that are missing from that immediate area, because what that does, again, is it gives you kind of a starting point. So maybe you've got a young male juvenile that is missing, and so they're looking at these bones. Do these bones look like bones that could match this particular individual? And there are certain things that you can look at. So maybe they identify, well, the bones aren't that of a male. Okay, well, then that probably is going to not be that particular missing person. So let's go to the next individual, or so on and so forth. And so again, you start with those in the immediate area and then expand outward, because we know that historically in criminal events, people can move bodies and deposit bodies in other locations. That is not an unusual phenomenon. But again, you want to start with those that it would most plausibly be from that particular location. So when you look at anthropological events, the big thing today is our ability to generate computerized models of what these individuals may have looked like, or even computerized models of the bones and the damage that the bones have incurred. Makes it much better for these anthropologists and for scientists being able to again put together or get a more clear picture of what these individuals may have been like while alive. So some of the different things that can be used, you've got MRIs and CT scans. You would also throw into that X-rays, and I think we've got that coming up in a slide here in just a few minutes. But when you look at kind of how forensic anthropology began, um, in 1849, there were some bones from individuals that had been disposed of by burning. a very inefficient way to get rid of human bodies historically. But uh, from that, they also had some false teeth that the individual had, and that was one of the ways that they used to uh, actually uh, secure a confession from the individual that committed the murder. So again, um, once you have the evidence, oftentimes presenting the individual that's guilty of the crime, oftentimes they will confess at that particular point. One of the other processes that was very common in the late 1800s was craniofacial superimposition. And what that simply means is they would take a picture of the person living, and they would take that picture and lay it over top of the skull that was found to look to see, do the eyes match up in terms of about where they could be, where does the mouth line up, does the nose line up, does it look fairly symmetrical from side to side of the skull. So there's lots of different ways that this can be done. Craniofacial superimposition, though, there's a lot of fudge room, if you will, associated with that. It's not a perfect science. It's a lot more subjective than objective, and so that's not one today that really you're going to see used a whole lot, if at all. Maybe initially, but not as like a definitive explanation. Um, in the late 1800s, there was a sausage maker that killed his wife, and as a result of that murder, he tried to dispose of her body by grinding her up in some of the different equipment in his factory. And they were able to recover pieces and parts, some bone fragments and teeth and things like that from the equipment that they then used to make a positive identification on the woman that was murdered. So again, several different things there. The CILHI, the Central Identification Laboratory, they are going to be responsible for recovering and identifying U.S. service personnel that have been killed in action or um, killed as a result of wartime activities, and they can then process those remains and make sure they're interred on American soil correctly and appropriately for their service. The DNA phenotyping, if you remember, we talked about that the last section, being able to accurately identify what someone looks like based on DNA evidence. So they can collect that DNA, they can reconstruct what their face looked like, what their skin tone looked like, what color their eyes were, what color their hair was, so on and so forth. And again, very, very accurate process. And we're going to come back to that this section as well. And then in 2019, they conducted a DNA analysis of a 5,000-year-old um, skeleton, and from that they were able to determine what the gender of that particular individual was. That's been repeated numerous times, obviously since 2019, and scientists are getting better and better, not only with the DNA phenotyping part, but also in terms of identification of gender and other key characteristics and features of the individuals. So that's really, really useful. Now, well, obviously, all of this is based on the idea of bone, of skeletal remains, because again, in the case of body identification, skeletal remains are quite common. In adults, we have 206 bones. You and I all start out as primarily cartilage upon birth, but shortly after birth, we start to have some bones that slowly begin that conversion from cartilaginous material into bone. Excuse me, which is good. But when you look, even among individuals of the same sex or same ethnicity or whatever, you're going to have slight variations that will exist. Not oftentimes really big variations, but slight variations that you'll oftentimes see. This particular picture is giving you an idea of, so you got the diaphysis, which is the long part of the bone, and the epiphyses are the ends of the bone, and where these epiphyses meet, you're going to have cartilage that prevents that bone on bone contact. Well, one of the things that scientists can do in the event of finding skeletal remains, they can look at these epiphyses and they can see how smooth or how rough they are. Oftentimes, the rougher they are, oftentimes, though not always, that's going to be indicative of an individual that's older and or has a lot of wear and tear as a result of using that joint, because you'll end up with arthritic type of conditions. Um, Again, you can see the growth plates that show up even on these X-rays of those bones. Once those growth plates are done, you'll those lines become a lot less clear. These end up being just kind of fused together, and so you don't see that same growth plate showing up. Um, in terms of bone function, a big thing is movement. Our muscles are going to pull against our bones, and that's what allows us to be able to move. So that's a big function of our skeletal system. Protection is another really important part when you think about your cranium and your rib cage, protecting some really vital organs with regard to brain and heart and lungs. So protection is a big part of that. Storage, in particular, of calcium. I don't remember what the amount is. It's more than a few pounds of calcium that you and I have stored in our bones. It's a lot, and that's a very important characteristic in that calcium is going to be very important in a number of chemical processes in the body. And then in terms of production of different blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, which we'll talk about here momentarily. Now, bones are hooked together via ligaments. So you've got the all the different types of ligaments, whether you're talking about like the ACL or the MCL or the PCL, right? We're in terms of ligaments with regard to the knee. So those that run along the front of the knee, sides of the knee, or back of the knee, depending upon where that particular ligament is found. But they're going to join bone to bone. And that prevents the bone from being moved out of alignment when forces are applied to it, whether it's via running or jumping or twisting or turning or whatever the case might be. So, really important. And then the muscles. So, muscles are going to be connected to bone via tendons. Okay. So, tendons are muscle to bone, ligaments are bone to bone. The chemical makeup of our bones is going to be calcium and phosphate. Calcium phosphate's a common compound that you'll find. Or the calcium rather, is going to be what provides a lot of the strength, the firmness in our bone, which ends up obviously being very important to provide that support protection. And then the phosphate is going to be responsible for a lot of the flexibility. We don't think about our bones being able to flex, and yet they do very nicely. Small amounts, oftentimes, large amounts, not as well. But that flexibility helps prevent them from fracturing when we do some of the different things that we do, whether jumping and landing or whatever the case might be. So the growth plates, also known as the epiphyseal plate, sorry, occur where the long bone and the diaphysis and the epiphysis where they're going to meet. Right. So as we talked about already, that's going to be the growth plate that you'll see in these different bones. All of our big, major, long bones are going to have those. And as we age, different parts, these epiphyseal plates will disappear at different times, depending upon age. Okay. All right. So as we look at bone, kind of already mentioned this a little bit. You got the diaphysis, the long part of the bone, the shaft of the bone, and then the epiphyses are going to be the ends of the bone, and they're slightly different. The long part, the diaphysis of the bone, is made up of a lot of compact bone. Compact bone is where you have these bone cells that are packed really closely together. They're exceptionally strong, very dense, provide great strength and rigidity. The downside to compact bone is that it does not twist or bend very well. So if you get stress in different directions outside of a single plane, compact bone does tend to fracture relatively easily. Epiphyseal, the epiphyses though are going to be made up of the spongy bone. You'll notice that the bone cells are further apart. You have almost these air pockets. It's not really air pockets, but you've got a space between these bones, and these epiphyses are able to withstand stresses in multiple directions much better. And so you get a little more flexion at the ends of the bone without fracturing. Which again, if you think about jumping, so as you and I jump and land, where our femur, our thigh bone, and our tibia, our shin bone meet, you wouldn't want those bones just banging against each other and not being able to flex a little bit. Pieces would chip off, and it does happen, right? We all hear stories about individuals that have bone chips or something like that as a result of some type of activity that they do, but it would be significantly worse if it weren't for the flexion of the bones that we see. So some of the other stuff that you'll see here, the yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is going to be part of what you'll find in the diaphysis of the bone. It's going to be the fatty material, and that yellow marrow is going to be responsible in terms of production of a few blood cells. But it is also a good spot to find a little bit of fat storage. So it is going to be important in terms of storage as well. If you think about animals that feed on skeletal remains or animals that kill prey items, so, for example, maybe a wolf eating an elk or something like that, they will chew on the bones and crack these open and be able to get to some of that marrow that's inside of those bones. It's very nutritious in terms of the nutrients that it's going to contain. The red bone marrow, you're going to have the red blood cells and white blood cells, and then some platelets that will be produced. And your red marrow is primarily in the epiphyses, the ends of the bone. Okay, so yellow marrow is in the long part, the diaphysis. Red marrow is going to be in the epiphyses. Um, all of our bone has a very thin covering over it, known as the periosteum. The periosteum provides a means of connection for blood vessels and for nerves into our bone. So if you take a look, so the next time maybe you eat a piece of chicken, like a chicken leg, and you pick off all the meat, all the muscle that was part of that chicken, look at the bone itself. You can actually see the openings where these blood vessels and nerves would enter that bone to be able to allow it to continue to grow and have nutrients that it needs to be able to function. So you can see those at that time period. All right. So some of the characteristics, obviously, that we've already mentioned with regard to bone, age, sex, ancestry, diseases, injuries, nutritional deficiencies, all of those, um, all of those aspects or characteristics. Many of them can be determined using bone, which is great. It becomes very important, obviously, when you start trying to figure out, well, what can we get from this information, and there's a lot. Okay. Isotope analysis, this is one that's not as frequently thought about or heard about, but you can analyze the skeletal remains for isotopes as well of certain elements, and that not necessarily will, but can give you a general location from where that individual may have come from, only if you have something to compare it to. But again, that will vary from case to case. So the starting kind of first with what we just talked about, bones and geography. Over time, as you and I go through life, eating food, drinking water, things like that, in the immediate area where we're going to be found, there are certain isotopes of certain elements that can make their way into bodies of water and into the foods that you and I consume. So if you eat animals from a local area, so maybe you eat lots and lots of deer meat from this particular area, or something like that. A lot of rabbit or squirrel. You get the idea. And they are going to consume water from the immediate area. There's going to be certain presence of certain elements in that water. And as you ingest that food, as you drink water from that immediate area, those elements become part of your skeletal makeup as well. So you'll store some of that in the skeleton that then can be analyzed to determine, again, whether or not it matches in quotation marks, the area in which you were found. Okay. Again, this one's not something that's used very often, but it is something that can be used in terms of identification. So it can be absorbed into the bone and the teeth. Remember, teeth are just an extension of our skeleton. Um, but again, both of these are going to be probably not very commonly used. And the reason being, I would anticipate, I don't know this, but I would anticipate it has to do with probably the cost associated with analyzing for this, the destructive nature that it's going to have on the bone, because obviously you're going to have to grind up bone to be able to conduct these tests. That's my guess. So take that with a grain of salt. I don't know for certain. So determining gender using the skeleton, this is one that's pretty good. You can the scientists especially, and even the layperson like you or I can kind of look at a skeleton and get a good idea as to whether or not it's male or female based on some of the characteristics. It's a lot of them are pretty identifiable. Um, so if you have someone that's past the age of puberty, being able to determine sex using the skeleton is really probably going to be one of the most accurate things that you can do. The DNA phenotyping notwithstanding, right? DNA phenotyping is going to be very, very accurate as well. But some of the things that you're going to look at, again, that can help give some guidance or some clues as to whether or not you're looking at a male or female skeleton, right? And these are going to be unofficial because there's always outliers. There are always exceptions to the rule, if you will. But in general, from a skeletal standpoint, females tend to be more slender. They're not as heavily built as most males. That's not always the case, and sometimes you'll have some males that are going to be more slender than a number of their counterparts. So, like I said, these are not official. They are not carved in stone. They do show some variation, but in general, these are some things that can be made or can be said. The muscle attachment, because oftentimes males tend to be more heavily muscled than females, though not always. Um, and so as a result of that, the points of attachment uh, where the muscle attaches to bone, remember the tendons attaching themselves to bone, uh, because of the force that those muscles exert on that attachment point, it's very important that that tendon, where it attaches to the bone, is exceptionally strong, because otherwise you would have the muscle pulling loose from the bone, and that would obviously create a number of problems. It does happen, right? Individuals that tear biceps or maybe tear a quad or a hamstring or something like that, where you have a part of a muscle that is going to tear itself loose from the skeleton, does create problems, and it does happen, but it tends to be really relatively infrequent. So, as we talk about gender and the skeleton, being able to identify differences between males and females, like I said, relatively simple for the most part, especially if you have some practice kind of comparing skeletal remains to be able to look at. Uh, but with males, um, what you'll see is that from the profile, side profile, you get a more sloped forehead on males and a more vertical forehead on females. Um, and why that is, I don't specifically know, but that just general shape of the cranium, males to females, is a little different there, and so that's one of them. The eye orbits on males tend to be more square. That's one that is listed, but in looking at the skulls that I've had the opportunity to look at, that's one that I struggle with. That's not one that I notice quite as well. The jawbone on males near 90, with a more pronounced posterior portion here. With females, you'll notice it's much more gentle in terms of sloping. So males are going to be much more angular. Females are not. So that's a good one. The occipital protuberance in males back here. This is the attachment point for a lot of the neck muscles where they attach to the skull. You'll notice that there is a spot for that connection that you don't see in the female skull, right? It's not as pronounced in the female skull as what you see here in the male skull. The mastoid process, in terms of males, the mastoid process is going to be this, all right, in males compared to females. You could throw into the prominent brow ridge in males as compared to females. Females don't have that, whereas most males are going to. So those are a few of the major features. It's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but again, you just notice kind of the sheer robustness of the male skull versus the female skull, um, more slender in terms of its overall structure. The pelvis is probably going to be one of the most easily identifiable portions of a skeleton with regard to determining gender. Um, because again, when you think about the differences in male and female in terms of our sexes, the one of the main uh, functions historically for females has been reproduction. So their skeleton is set up to allow them to be able to carry a baby, to be able to birth that baby, so on and so forth. And so as a result of that, when you look at the characteristics between the two, some of them are definitely a little bit easier to be able to identify. So in terms of the female pelvis, generally wider in terms of its measure from side to side. um, so the iliac crest here, the top portion of the ilium, uh, this is going to be um, a little bit wider in females. You'll see in males it tends to go a little bit higher vertically. Uh, Females tends to just be more opened up side to side. You've got the sacrum in males, um, tends to curve inward towards the front of the body. In females, it's pushed more back. And again, what that does is it keeps that tailbone out of the way, creates a wider opening for babies to pass through that birth canal. Okay. What else do we have here? Is shorter tailbone. Again, in terms of here, tailbone is the coccyx, so that tailbone tends to be shorter in females. The larger subpubic angle. This is the subpubic angle that you'll see. So in females, that's a much wider angle than what you see in males. And again, when you think about what happens when a woman is pregnant, getting ready to give birth, you'll have this cartilage that connects the two halves of the pelvis together. This will soften, and it allows that opening to become larger to be able to allow the baby to pass through, obviously, as the woman is getting ready to give birth, which ends up obviously being a good thing. More circular pelvic opening in women, that tends to be larger in terms of its diameter. When you look at a male pelvis and a female pelvis on a skeleton, they are noticeably different, and so that makes it a little bit easier to be able to identify. Additionally, if a woman has given birth, what you may find are marks on the pelvis, um, as a result of the birthing process, and then the pubic symphysis. That's this area right here. You may see where that is not as rigid or as firm or as locked into place as what you might see in a female that has not given birth. Okay. So again, so kind of again some different things to kind of look at. So that's gender. So we've talked about geographical location. We've talked about gender. Next thing is going to be looking at age, and with regard to age calculations, this is not as set. Oftentimes with age, you're going to find a kind of a window, if you will. But taking different bones and looking at the window of when the ossification process has occurred or does occur can help you narrow down the approximate age of an individual. Okay, so the amount of ossification, how much wear and tear. This kind of goes back to one of the things that I talked about earlier, being able to look at the ends of the bone to see if there's any um, any damage that's been done, right? That's going to result in any arthritic type of conditions, and then dental records are going to be important, especially in the case of children, determining Gender with children would be difficult. Determining age with children can be very difficult as well because there is a gap in terms of when ossification will occur. So, sex is different population individuals. Ossification is going to vary. Um, but what I have on here is just in general um, some ages at when you're going to see a lot of the ossification processes take place, right? And so again, if you combine different pieces and parts of these, you can kind of get an idea of how old someone may have been when their skeleton was left there. But some of these, you notice, like you've got a 9 year period of time, 5 year period of time, 5 year period of time, 8 year period of time, right? So there's big ranges for some of these, and so it doesn't create a perfectly exact guesstimate. But these are relatively true for most individuals. And so, again, you can use the different pieces and parts to kind of look at when a lot of the ossification is going to take place. If you have a lot of bones that are not fully ossified, or you have bones where you still see a lot of epiphyseal growth plates, that's going to indicate that the individual has not reached maturity. So they're going to be a relatively young individual. Teeth are really good. Again, like I mentioned, they're going to be especially important in terms of children in the unfortunate event that a child's body is discovered. Um, but again, they know about when the teeth are going to erupt from the gums and at about what age those start to show up. So you can see here at about 7.5 months of age, you're going to get the central incisors. By about 9 months, you're going to have the lateral incisors. And again, they're not carved in stone, but they're relatively consistent in terms of when you'll see these. And the same thing is true then for adult teeth as well. The times when you start to see a lot of these begin to show up. So they can use a combination of teeth, among other things, to get um, a guesstimate as to when or what age that individual might have been. Okay. Again, wear and tear patterns on teeth indicate foods that individuals might have eaten. An approximate age based on the amount of tooth damage that's been done. Um, Again, lots of other things can influence how our teeth are going to grow, the condition that they're going to be in, and so because of that, that does provide a little bit more um, pieces of evidence that can be used to identify age of an individual. Okay, so as we look at the skeletal ossification stuff, really kind of just building off of what we've looked at um, with regard to the cranial sutures, the formation of those bones that over time, as we age, fuse more and more together until eventually uh, the existence of those lines is completely gone. All right. So again, you can kind of use all of these in conjunction with one another to really be able to guesstimate an approximate age of an individual. So again, it's a relatively known rate, and you can look at those suture lines to determine what kind of where they're at. So you've got open suture lines, you've got the minimally fused, and then you've got the completely obliterated. And completely obliterated would be this, minimally fused would be this, and the open would be this. So the suture lines are still present. The suture lines are still there to some degree, but they're starting to go away, indicating that the bone is in fact ossifying. And then finally, when the bone is completely ossified. Okay. Um, so you get something like this. What's the likely age range of a male skeleton? Open sagittal suture. All right. So if we go male open, so they have to be younger than 32, and fused clavicular epiphyseal plate. Now we didn't talk about that, but we know they've got to be younger than 32. And I think let's go back one slide here real quick. And I know I shouldn't do this. Mm, clavicle and sternum between the ages of 22 and 30. So if we were to take that, and I think that will work with what we're looking at. I don't know that it came from the same source, but if we were to look at that, so we know they have to be younger than 32 because it's still completely open. But we have a fused clavicular plate, so that's going to be 22 to 30. So we can guess, we know that they're going to be less than 32. I would guess probably maybe around the age of 30. Let's see what we get when we do that. 19 to 32. So there you go. Or you've got a window and you're like, well, that's a 13-year window. That's not really that specific. And 100%, you're correct, except that we know we're not looking for an old person. I know some of you say 32 is old. 32 is not old, right? You're not looking for an old person. You're really not even looking for a middle-aged person. 19 to 32 is a pretty young individual. And again, what that would do is it would allow you to know about what age range, maybe of missing persons, you should be investigating, right? So there would be a certain number of individuals you could kick out based on gender, right? Because we know it's a male. Others that we could kick out because maybe they're too old. Some that would be too young. And so this would allow, again, investigators to narrow their range to be able to identify maybe who that came from. Now, looking at certain features of the skeleton to be able to, again, figure out different characteristics, but you can see here how the skeleton changes as we age. And when we're very young, things are in very good shape. As we age, they tend to degrade just a little bit. So the pubis symphysis that we had talked about previously begins rough with ridges and grooves, rough with ridges and grooves, and over time becomes porous and pitted. This would be porous and pitted, right? It loses um, um, that smoothness, sort of, with the ridges and the grooves that we start out with, and ends up very very different. Okay, you get the same type of thing where the fourth rib attaches to the sternum, because again, it's a cartilaginous type of connection there as well. And so again, you expect to see this similar type of progression in that particular location. Being able to distinguish ancestry in terms of ethnic backgrounds. So you've got those individuals that are going to be of African descent, European descent, and Asian descent. Um, but again, it's not something that is going to be a standalone piece of information. So you're not going to be able to look at the shape of the eye orbits and say, oh, it's definitely European or definitely African or definitely Asian. You're going to have to look at several pieces of information to be able to make that assessment and to be uh, very accurate with it at all. Okay. But in terms of that, you want objective measurements because that's going to give you the best reliability. The subjective measurements, the shape of the skull, the palate, and then the teeth characteristics themselves. Like I said, it's not just a singular characteristic; it's combinations of these together that will allow it to be able to be made. The nasal index measures, with this, you're going to take the ratio of the width of the nasal opening to the height of the opening. And so from that, you're going to end up with, in general, in general, these three categories. Whether it's all that accurate or not, again, uh, that's a little bit debatable. Okay. And then again, suture the frontal bone to the nasal bone parts there, so you can see. Let me move this real quick. Multiply that by 100 for your last part of. Okay. All right. So to be able to estimate height, there are a number of different databases, formulas, whatever you want to call them, that are going to be used to help determine what the height of the individual was while they were living. Okay. So again, being able to identify the ethnicity of the skeleton is important. It's going to make this a lot more accurate. You could do it without, and you would get a range. So if you calculated If you knew you had a male skeleton, but you didn't know what ethnic background it was, you could do this for all of them, and you would end up with a range. Now, that's going to be a big range, and it may not be super helpful, but again, it would still give you a piece of information that you could kind of rely upon to kind of refer back to. The nice thing is they're separate formulas in terms of males and females, and for each of the different bones. So this is just for the fibula that you would use this for. And I have some of the different formulas on here as well. You'll see that as well. Again, knowing the sex and ancestry is going to make it a whole heck of a lot more accurate. Without it, you can still calculate them, but you're losing a lot of the accuracy that you would otherwise see associated with that skeleton. So this is what I was talking about, right? Several different bones. You'll notice that these are all long bones in the body, the femur and the leg, the tibia and the lower leg. So this is your thigh, right? Fibula in your lower leg, the small bone at the back of your calf. Your humerus is your upper arm bone. Ulna is the bone that follows your pinky in your forearm, and your radius is the bone that follows your thumb in your forearm. Okay. You'll notice here formulas are calculated for adult males. Okay. Adult males. Um, but for adult males and females, so again, you get a little bit of variation between the two. But again, this is something that has been done many, 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 many times. The weird thing is, if you look, for whatever reason, when this table was put together, and again, it's older, but there's no information available for Asian females for each of the different bones. And why that is, I don't know. Whether Dr. Bass didn't have enough or didn't have any individuals that are of Asian descent that he used. I couldn't answer that question. But who knows? That could be a possibility. So if you have an African American male that has a humerus that was 37.6, so African American male, we've got the humerus bone, so you're going to take 2.88 times that 37.6. You're going to add to that 75.48 centimeters, and um, that is going to give you an estimated height in centimeters, and you could then make that conversion to inches, right? But if you do that, you get your math. What you're going to find out is about 108.3 centimeters. Um, and again, if you make that conversion, then you can figure out, or 183.8 centimeters, you make that conversion then, and you find out that they were about 6 foot 5. Again, plus or minus a little bit, you're going to have a little bit of variation there, um, depending upon on what that might be. Okay, so using the skeleton to kind of figure out some unusual things based on characteristics and what is available and visible, you'll notice in this skeleton, right? You'll notice that this jawbone and the upper maxilla have shown significant damage. So there's some type of decay probably that was taking place. You'll notice that in this skeleton, you can see here, there's another tooth that is underneath this particular tooth. Again, some infections. This tooth is really high up in the maxilla. Did not grow down the way that it would be anticipated. This tooth was never erupted from the skeleton either. So kind of interesting. But um, again, some type of infection associated with the bone in that particular area. So healthy bones, when they break, snap. Okay, um, and so they end up being very jagged in terms of their in terms of their characteristic or in terms of their appearance. Skeletonized bones, they're going to snap, but they snap evenly, and so they end up with relatively uh, uh, even types of breaks. Healthy bones do not. All right. So osteoporosis, osteoarthritis can influence how bones break. With this, what we're looking at is a bone fracture that has taken place. And you can see that over a period of time, the healing that occurs in that individual, right, in terms of what it's going to kind of look like over time. Now, um, as bones heal, you'll still be able to see where those fractures were, and doctors can tell based on the amount of healing about how long ago that fracture occurred. And so again, that ends up being useful. It can be used today, unfortunately, in the cases of things like child abuse or even elder abuse because of osteoporosis and osteoarthritis. Um, but again, they can be used in a number of ways. Being able to look at the skeleton, you can sometimes see what nutrients were available or not available to individuals as well. Now, this is one that I recently read about and just thought it was interesting, so I thought I would include it as well. Anemia, a lack of iron, can lead to these weird little kind of pinholes that you see in the upper portion of the eye sockets. From what I read, that's not always a really good dead giveaway in terms of certain conditions, but it is one that has been noted with relative accuracy in a number of different skeletons. So that's one that that they've used historically as well. Lack of vitamin D is going to lead to rickets. This is a femur. Your femur should not be bent like this. So this indicates that this individual didn't have good vitamin D exposure. And so as a result of that, they ended up with the formation of the rickets. These bones end up being misformed. So it's going to affect gait and things like that. But again, different ways of being able to identify those. And then upon exposure to certain chemicals, those chemicals can be stored in the skeleton as well. We had talked about that previously from the standpoint of geography. There is a story. The Radium Girls were a group of women that were employed by a particular watchmaker, and they would use radium to paint on the watch faces so that they would glow in the dark. Well, in order to get their brushes to be able to paint these super fine um, images on these watch faces, the women would lick the bristles of the brush to make them super fine and pointy. Well, obviously they were doing this with radium. Radium is radioactive. And so they did this over and over for years at a time. A lot of them ended up with various cancers and died as a result of various cancers. And so they dug up or excavated, exhumed some of the bodies and some of the skeletons, and they were still able to detect the radium in the bones of the individual. Probably, I don't remember how old, how many years ago it was, 50, 60, 70 years ago, if not more. They were still able to get readings of that radioactivity in those skeletons because it had been absorbed into the bone. So again, lots of information to be gleaned from skeletal remains. In terms of collecting and preserving, the biggest thing initially, as you can tell from this particular picture, the biggest thing is going to be photographing them in their natural state. Okay, so you want to get as many pictures as possible of that particular skeleton, the way that it was found, the way that the pieces were arranged, or whatever, because that can indicate lots of things. So, for example, in this particular picture, we can see some type of headdress or something that was put on their head. Looks like there's a necklace of some particular type that is included. We can see this individual was laid out in this particular setting. So they weren't just thrown into a heap, they were laid out deliberately in this particular act. Again, the arrow's probably, if I were to guess, going to indicate north. I don't know that, but you've got a scale, a ruler as a scale reference to be able to compare back to. So again, you want to be able to get these in situ, right? In situ simply means that they are where they were found, the way that they were found. And this is going to be true whether you're talking criminal cases, in the case of like an archaeological dig, whatever. Right? You want to be able to look at them in their original state as much as possible. Anything that might be present, you want to make note of. So maybe you found a body that was dumped, or at least the skeletonized remains of a body that was dumped. Maybe there's a bullet that is present in that location in that grave site that wasn't there previously, or that maybe the individual that experienced that shooting was unable to see previously. So you want to collect all of those to be able to make sense of what took place. I include this just to give you perspective, right? As you look at the picture, you go, something's not quite right about this, right? And obviously, you can see the fact that the individual's head is kind of tucked underneath of them just a little bit. And you can see here, it looks to be a relatively clean cut. So you can surmise that this individual was probably beheaded in some way, and then their head was put in the ground, and then their body was laid in then on top of it, right? And we know that because the skull's not on top of the pelvis is on top of the skull, and it's laying underneath where their backside and their back would have been, right? Because we can see here based on the orientation of the feet and legs that their body is facing upward, right? So again, you can see the scapulas, the shoulder blades, they're down against the ground. So we know that their back was laying against the soil and their head was placed in there before the rest of their body. Now, being able to search for skeletons, um, most of the time, these will be deliberate acts. Individuals are actively searching to try to find where individuals have been deposited. Sometimes they're accidental. In the case of sometimes maybe with missing persons or a body discovery in a wooded area or any number of things, right? But in this particular case, this picture showing the identification of possible mass grave sites in Bosnia, with the activities that are taking place currently um, in the Ukraine. Obviously, there's a number of mass grave sites that have been identified. And so then you're going to have the excavation process that'll take place. But identifying graves, um, there's lots of different things that are going to be done. Whether you're searching individually or using drones or aerial photography, whatever, there's lots of different ways to be able to find them. But some of the things that they're going to look for, raised soil is going to indicate an area that's been dug up and then filled back in. And then if you have collapsed soil, that simply indicates that whatever was put in that area has begun to settle, right? So you can use cadaver dogs that are able to identify the smell of decaying material, ground penetrating radar. If you've ever seen that, they have a machine basically that is drug along, and as it's drug along, it's sending beams or sound waves down into the ground and recording how long it takes for those sound waves, then to make their way back to the device. And they're able to detect anomalies underneath the ground, weird things that may not fit with what you would anticipate. It can be used in the case of concrete and all kinds of neat stuff. The ground penetrating radar is pretty neat. Heat sensitive imagery in the event that you have someone that you think has just recently been buried. You can get a difference in soil temperatures where a warm body is located versus the cool ground surrounding it. And then aerial photography, whether you've got drones or airplanes or helicopters or whatever. Again, you're going to be trying to identify some disturbed area that doesn't match everything else. With this one, um, you'll notice it says here vehicle movement. These are going to be tire tracks. So in the event of a possible mass grave, it makes sense that you would have large vehicles that either dug up the area, dumped bodies in the area, and then you would have like backhoes, you would have dozers, you would have excavators that are going to go in and then fill those areas, right? So you're looking for disturbed areas. So in terms of collecting it, you're going to figure out how big of an area you're looking at. With ancient civilization type of sites, these can be really, really, really large areas, depending upon what took place or what kind of burial site you're looking at. Um, there is a site evidence form that's going to indicate drawings, directions, approximate size areas, all that stuff. You're going to take pictures of the skeletons as they're found. right? You're going to photograph everything. You're going to document it all. You're going to draw it out in a site map. All of that information needs to be part of what is recorded. Um, Again, you're going to count skulls or femurs in the case of mass graves to see whether or not everything matches in the unfortunate situation that that's what you're gonna find. And then from those, oftentimes you can also see whether they're hasty burials, like individuals were just dumped in one big pile, or whether, like in this case, this appears that individuals have been laid out very specifically. So again, a different type of setup altogether. Again, looking for anything else that might be present. Once that is done, the skeletonized parts or the skeleton can be removed. You may have to bring in a sifting device or a sifter to be able to scoop soil into and then shake it through to collect bigger or more solid pieces. So, in the case maybe where they have an individual that's been burned in a fire pit, they will take and scoop that material through a sifter to be able to extract any other bones or teeth or anything else that might be present in that location. Again, you can sometimes remove these things intact. Keeping the bones intact oftentimes can become quite challenging because, again, after we're dead, bones become quite brittle. But there are materials that you can coat those bones with that will allow them to remain relatively intact with very few breaks. Which, in the case especially of like historical digs, is going to be the key. All right, so once we have the skeleton out, being able to analyze it and get some information from it is going to be very, very important. And so the initial things that might be documented, whether or not you see any trauma to any of the bones, are they fractured? Do the fractures look like they occurred before they died, at the time of death, or after they died? Is there anything? Do you see bullets? Is there a knife that's protruding out of part of the skeleton? In this case, do you find some type of blade that's embedded in this case in the skull? That is a pretty telling feature, I would say, for this individual, right? But there's other things that you could as well. All right, so identify if it's bone, then if it's human, and then from there you're gonna go from there. So how long ago did it die? What was their age, ancestry, all of the things that we've talked about thus far. But cause and manner of death are also going to be very, very. Okay, so in terms of analyzing the skeletons, like I had mentioned quite a little bit ago now, you've got MRIs, CT scans, X-rays, all that can be used to analyze the bone, see whether or not there's something that may be embedded in the bone, or just to be able to get information about the density of the bone, the condition of the bone, whether there's any fractures that you can't see, anything like that could be possible in that setting. Non-imaged record comparison, what that simply means is we're looking primarily at dental records as much as anything. If there's some type of implant that's been done, so maybe somebody has a dental implant that's been made in modern times. Dental implants will have serial numbers and things like that on there that can help identify individuals, right? What else do we have? DNA analysis. So if we're going to do DNA phenotyping, you can get nuclear DNA depending upon the age and condition of the skeleton and what it's been exposed to. Um, Under the right settings, you can get enough DNA to be able to do STR profiling, that short tandem repeat stuff that we had talked about previously. Um, Teeth are going to be really good because the tissue in teeth is really well protected. The pulp is really, really well protected from bacterial activity, obviously UV light, things like that. All of those are going to be very difficult to damage that material. So ends up being better there. Remember the mitochondrial DNA and then the Y testing as well, Y chromosome testing. So from that you can do paternal. Remember, mitochondrial is maternal. Okay, so a couple differences there that you need to make note of. All right, so today, photographic or video superposition is not something that's going to be used very much. They can do it as a comparison just to get an idea. Yeah, this might be what we think it is, or no, it isn't. But like I said before, it's a very subjective process. What's going to be better today is this facial reconstruction, the craniofacial reconstruction. And there are measurements that have been taken of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals of different ethnic backgrounds, of different ages, all of that good stuff. And so now they know approximate thicknesses of different portions of the body. And so they can then build that up, and you put that together with what the DNA phenotyping stuff says, and you can get a pretty accurate prediction of what that individual may have looked like. Okay, uh, so they're able to do that and again end up with ideas of what those individuals looked like when they were alive. So analyzing the skeleton for trauma again can give clues as to potential cause and manner of death, what might have led to their demise, or at least what their life was like. So you've got injuries that occurred during their life that is known as antemortem injuries. Looking at the skeleton, there will be fractures or damage that's been done to those bones that's showing healing because it occurred long enough before their death that repairs were being made by the body. Okay. So whether it's the calcification of an area, whether it's a uh, skeletal hematoma, whatever the case might be, there will be different characteristics that can be looked at that can be used to help identify that damage. Anything right before death is perimortem. These are not going to be healed. The fractures themselves are going to be relatively clean in terms of the break. And then you've got the post-mortem stuff. Post-mortem is after they're dead, and these, especially looking at skeletal remains, the edges themselves are going to be caused by compression, animals breaking and chewing on the bones, temperature changes. All of that is going to make the bones to be very very brittle. Um, and so those injuries or those damages oftentimes are a little easier to discern. So looking at skeletal trauma and cause, again, might be able to determine what weapon or object was used to cause the damage. Oftentimes, shape is going to be a clue. The amount of damage done to the bone itself will be a clue. So the hyoid bone in the neck is one that can sometimes be used to show strangulation, whether it's in the case of like a noose, whether it's a manual strangulation by hand, whether it's done by some other object. That's not a dead giveaway, but sometimes that can be used to help identify if a person was strangled. Defensive wounds are going to show up. Now, this isn't great because this is obviously in the tissue, but if this were deep enough to go to the bone, you would see marks in the bone that would indicate this individual tried to protect themselves from someone wielding a sharp edged weapon. Uh, Whether it's on your forearms, there can be fractures in well, if someone's being hit maybe with a bat and they put their hands up to try to protect themselves, there can be fractures there as a result of that. So you can tell defensive wounds, gunshots. The entrance itself is going to be small, and you're going to end up with pieces of the bone being removed. This isn't a lot unlike what we saw with the glass evidence, kind of where you have pieces that are going to be missing. The same thing is going to be true of a gunshot. Um, for that individual. Notice the radiating fractures as a result of that gunshot. This is only going to occur prior to and right at the time of death, so that you can see those. We can't see here super well, but there are pieces of bone that have been removed from this skull as a result of the movement of that bullet through the cranium. Um, Blunt force objects, lots of radiating damage as a result of that object colliding with the skull. And then sharp force, you don't get the radiating stuff because it's not doing as much crushing as much as it is as cutting, right? So this individual was struck with some sharp edged weapon. Again, it could have been a sword, it could have been an axe, it could have been who knows what, right? Something that just simply fractured, cut this skull in that particular means. All right, so advances in forensic anthropology. Um, Prior to 2019, this is impressive. Prior to 2019, one of every three cases related to skeletal discovery went unsolved, right? One in every three. So 33% of cases that involved skeletal remains, they couldn't say who it was, how it got there, those types of things, right? Well, since you now have the DNA profiling stuff, this likelihood has improved dramatically, right? Because of DNA phenotyping, now we get a much better idea of what these individuals looked like, um, and they can so what they can do is, again, if they can get DNA evidence from the skeletal remains, they then can um, feed that into the system. That's going to generate eye color, skin tone, hair color, certain facial features, and they can then superimpose that, if you will, over the skull to see whether or not it looks like it works, right? And so from that, they're able to get a lot more specific information to be able to determine what the individual looked like. All right. So from DNA phenotyping, this is what they anticipated the individual looked like, and this is the real life photograph of the individual. Right. That's pretty astounding. Hair color is correct. Shape of the face is fairly correct. The mouth is fairly correct. The nose is correct. It's really impressive in terms of what they're able to do. And obviously, as this technology improves, the ability to identify missing individuals from their computer generated profiles is only going to increase. So, hopefully, you enjoyed this unit on forensic anthropology. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you